All right, so we're going to start English Literature 1 in this class meeting. In this first video, what we'll do is we'll walk through an introduction to English literature. I'll explain how it relates to your other studies and what we're trying to do in English literature. And we'll talk about the 4 different English literature classes that we're going to study, and then we'll get started with English Literature 1 to study Homer's Iliad. Yesterday, we talk again and again about high school requirements, and let's just put this into some context. For high school English, which is one of the 5 high school subjects, you need 120 hours of instructional time times 4 years, which makes a total of 480 hours. 480 hours of English studies. And English studies, make sure you jot this down. English studies includes English grammar, which we're going to study in classical grammar. So English grammar, English composition, which is actually the most important part of the study of English, and thirdly, English literature. So anytime we talk about high school English, we're talking about these 3 subjects: English grammar, English composition, and English literature. That's what we mean by English in high school English. And it's one of the 5 subjects that's required for a high school diploma. All right? So anytime we say English in high school studies, we're talking about grammar, composition, and literature. All right? In grammar, we study the rules of the language, the rules of the English language. In grammar, we study the rules of the language. The reason why we have to study rules of language is because we can't communicate unless we all agree on the language, right? We have to agree how we're going to say things in order to communicate. So we have to study grammar because we basically have to study the rules that men have developed and agreed on to communicate. We have to learn to communicate the way other men communicate. And because we want to be able to communicate clearly. We want to make sure that when we say something, whether we're speaking or writing, we say it in a way where other people can't interpret it to mean something else or not understand what we're saying. So we want to follow the rules of the language, and then we expect others to also study grammar, and we expect them to also follow the rules of the language. That's how we communicate. So that's the purpose of the study of grammar. In composition, we seek to study how to express our ideas, how to express and communicate our ideas. Now, what's unique to you as an individual is your own ideas, your thoughts, your experiences. Whatever you want to share with others is unique. Your grammar can't be unique. You can't make up your own grammar. You have to communicate in the way that everyone else understands. But your ideas are going to be unique, and you express your ideas through composition. And so when we study composition, we work to express our ideas. We then check our composition and make sure that when we express our ideas, we use proper grammar so that everyone else can understand it, right? So the goal, when to write your ideas is not just to write your ideas. The goal is to communicate them. If you don't want to communicate them, why write them, right? You already have them. The purpose of writing is for other people. And so the goal of composition is to write in a way that other people can understand, okay? So you're not just expressing your own ideas. People will say things like that, like, oh, I'm just well, there's no reason to write something that just expresses your own ideas. You're writing it to communicate. So in composition, we work to learn to express our ideas. We use grammar, we use the rules of language to check our composition and make sure that we've shared our ideas in a way that everyone else can understand. So grammar really comes after composition because we use it to check and correct our composition. And then lastly, we study literature. Literature really is like a history class, because in literature, we seek to study how other people have expressed their ideas. Okay? We study the history of other people's compositions. Does that make sense? Remember in history class, we said, why do we study history? We said, we study history to learn from other people's experiences. Right? Well, the same is true in literature. We study literature not just to learn a good story. We study to see how other people have composed and expressed their ideas so that we can learn from their examples. Okay? So in literature, we study the history of composition. In literature, we study the history of composition. Because in the past, there have been men who have been very wise, very effective at communicating their ideas. And we can go back, study their writings, and see what they did, see how they did it. And I'll give you a good example of this. A good example that you're all familiar with is Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. You sit there and read the books. And what happens when you read the books? You just get lost in the story. You're talking about Gandalf and Bilbo and Frodo. You're lost in the story, right? Reading page after page or watching the movies. You're in the story. You're watching the story, listening to the story, reading the story. And what you're not thinking about is a man composed that story with blank sheets of paper. J.R. Tolkien sat down with blank sheets of paper and he composed that story. All the characters, all the fake languages that they speak, all the places, all the names, he composed all of that. And it's so well composed, so effective, that you don't even remember that this is a person's composition. You're lost in the story, talking about the characters, talking about the places, right? And you don't even notice that this is somebody making up a story and composing a story. That's how effective the composition is, okay? So there's two different ways to study Lord of the Rings. You can study it like a lazy person just watching television and just pay attention to the story. You can learn about the characters and the events and the places, what happens, and you can just read the book or watch the movie like you watch any show. That's just lazy. That's not the study of literature. Okay? To study literature, we're not going to focus on the story. We're not going to focus on the characters. We're going to focus on the writer. We're going to focus on the fact that you're looking at a composition. You're looking at an example of something that someone else composed. And we want to see, what is it about that story that makes it so interesting? Because haven't you picked up a book and read it and said, oh, this book is terrible. It's so boring. The story's not even realistic. The story's not even believable. It's really a dumb story. And you just throw the book aside, right? So we have to deal with that. We see examples of stories or even movies. You watch a movie and you're like, this movie's terrible, right? The actors are bad in this movie. It's so cheesy. And you see an example of a bad movie, but then you turn around another day and you see an example of a good movie. And you can't stop watching it. And you watch it 100 times. right? And you see the difference. Well, we have to ask, when we study literature, we have to ask, what's making one story really interesting and what's making another story not interesting? What's making one book so good that I can't put it down and I read it 5 times, and what's making another book so boring that I can't read 3 pages? We want to ask why. What's the difference? What are the writers doing that makes one story interesting and another story not interesting? Okay? So you see, in literature, we're focusing on the composition. We're focusing on the writer and trying to learn from the writer what makes this story interesting. Okay? So we can learn and we can think about that in our own writing when we have to write something. If you wrote a story and someone was reading it, would it be like reading something from Tolkien? Or would it be reading like the boring story that nobody likes? Okay? So we want to study literature to learn how other great writers composed their writings, whatever kind of. It could be an imaginative story, it could be history, it could be any kind of writing. But there is some writing that interests us, that becomes famous because everybody thinks it's interesting, and there's other writing that no one ever reads because no one likes it. It's boring, okay? So in literature, we study the history of other men's compositions, and we focus on the writers and how they write, not just the story. So if you're reading Lord of the Rings for fun, and you're just sitting around reading the story for your own interest in the story, that's not literature. That's just entertainment, right? Literature is when we actually study it and think about the writer and how he's telling the story, how he's creating Tolkien created those characters. There's no such thing as Gollum. There's no such thing as Gandalf or Bilbo or Frodo or the Shire. Tolkien created all those characters, and you think of them like they're real people because he made them so realistic. And every time you see Gandalf in the story, he acts the same way, he talks the same way. Every time you see Frodo or Gollum, they have the same character. Well, Tolkien had to create that character. And when you start to think about what it took to create that story, it's pretty amazing. And that's the talent of great writers. The same thing is true of Shakespeare and Homer and Virgil and all the other great writers. You'll be amazed when you start to think about the fact that a man created this story with blank paper. That's what makes literature amazing, and that's why we study. To try to learn from the history of other men's compositions so that we can take ideas from them and bring them into our own composition. Not that we're going to write epic poems and, whole series of novels and things like that, but anytime we write, we want to take ideas and lessons that we can learn from these writers and use them in some way in our own composition. Okay? So there's 3 parts to high school English, or to any English. Grammar, where we learn the rules of the language, how all men agree to communicate. Composition, where we actually practice expressing our ideas. And then literature, where we study the history of other men's compositions. You got that? Okay. You understand the difference between just reading a story for fun and studying for literature. You understand the difference? Okay. So that's what we're going to work on in high school English. And in this course, English Literature 1, we're going to focus on literature. But we're going to refer to our studies in grammar and our work in composition as we study literature. So we have to do all 3. All right? And they all help each other. Now, as for literature, in high school English, we have 4 different courses. So let's talk about these 4 courses. In this course, English Literature 1, we're going to study ancient literature. Or I should say ancient and classical. Ancient and classical literature. In Literature 2, we're going to study medieval medieval literature. In English Literature 3, we're going to study what we can call British literature, modern English literature, and then fourth, we're going to study modern American literature. So English 1, 2, 3, and 4, just like in world chronology, how you studied on different periods of time in history, in English literature, we study literature from different periods in history. Ancient and classical in English literature 1, medieval literature in English literature 2, modern British or English literature in English literature 3, and then modern American literature. There's really no such thing as modern American literature because all American literature is modern literature. Okay, so American literature in English literature 4. That's what we'll study in the 4 high school English literature courses. Now, one problem we have with studying ancient and medieval literature is that those works were written in other languages. Homer wrote in Greek. Virgil wrote in Latin. Dante, in medieval literature, Dante wrote in Italian. So the books were originally written in other languages. Now, in English literature, we're not going to study Homer in Greek. We're not going to study Virgil in Latin or Dante in Italian. We're going to study English translations. All right? And that's one problem that we have in English literature is we're really not studying Homer and Virgil and Dante. We're studying translations of them. Okay? So it's really not fair to call this classical literature. It's really not fair to do that because we're not studying the real classical literature. We're studying English translations of classical literature. Okay? English translations of medieval literature. And we're going to do 2 or 3 different things at the same time. We're going to become familiar with ancient literature. We're going to learn the story of Homer's Iliad, for example. We're going to learn the story of Dante's Divine Comedy. We're going to study Shakespeare and Chaucer and get into American literature. We're going to learn all of these stories and we're going to read all of these works. We're going to get the ideas of them, but we're not going to study the actual languages and actual words of the original writers. You understand the difference? All right? And there's a lot of value in those original languages, but we're not going to do that in this course. What we're going to do is study important English translations that allow us to learn the content of these works, but also study English literature. Okay? So, for example, when we study Homer's Iliad, you know from world chronology that Homer lived around 750 years before Christ. Homer lived in 750 BC and he wrote in Greek. So Homer's Iliad is a Greek book. And it's a poem. So not only is it Greek, but it's a poem. The whole entire story, 24 books make up the whole story. 24 books. Every single line is poetry. It has a rhythm or a meter. Every single line in Greek. We're not going to read that Greek poem. Okay? We're going to read a translation of Homer by an English poet named Alexander Pope, who lived in modern times. And he translated Homer's Iliad, but what's interesting is that he didn't just translate it word for word. He translated it into an English poem. So Alexander Pope translated Homer's Homer's Greek poem into an English poem. So we're going to have the opportunity to learn about English poetry, which is useful, but we're also going to learn the story of Homer's Iliad, which is useful. Okay, so we're going to do both at the same time. We're going to learn English poetry, and we're also going to learn the content of the writings of these ancient poets. So that's what we're going to do in English Literature 1. What we're going to study in English Literature 1, we're not going to study 100 different books. We're only going to study 2 or 3, maybe 4 different books. The first book we're going to study in English literature, like I said, is Homer's Iliad. That's the first book we're going to study. The second book we're going to study is Homer's Odyssey. Two poems written by Homer, written around 750 BC, about the Trojan War. The third book we're going to read is a Roman poem, Virgil's Aeneid. And the fourth book we're going to read is a book by a Roman poet named Ovid that's titled Metamorphoses. Those are the 4 books that we're going to study in English Literature 1. 2 works that are Greek, 2 works that were originally Latin. All of them are going to be studied in English translation. Homer's Iliad, Homer's Odyssey, Virgil's Aeneid, and Ovid's Metamorphoses. These first 3 stories are all about the Trojan War, in a way. The Iliad and the Odyssey talk about, well, the Iliad talks about the life of Achilles and his bravery during the Trojan War. The Odyssey actually talks about what happened after the Trojan War, when the war was over and one of the famous Greek soldiers, Odysseus, returned home from war. The Odyssey is named after the main character, Odysseus. So it's his return home after the war. And personally, this is my favorite story in all of literature, Homer's Odyssey. I think you're going to love it. This third story, Virgil's Aeneid, was written during the Roman Empire. And it's also about the Trojan War. It's about what happens after the Trojan War. In the Odyssey, we learn that Odysseus, who was a Greek soldier, goes back home to his island where he's the king. And what happens? But what happened to the Trojans after the Trojan War? Right? They were defeated and the city was burned down. But what happened to the Trojans? Virgil tells us that one Trojan escaped Troy, and he sailed away with his family, and he sailed to a foreign land, and when he got to that foreign land, he was the father of a new race of people, and that race of people grew up to become the Romans. So Virgil tells us that the Romans actually came from Troy. So Rome is like a new Troy, all right? And we're going to learn about that in Virgil's Aeneid. And then this last book, Ovid's Metamorphoses, is a poem. This is where all mythology comes from. All of the famous stories of mythology, classical mythology, they come from Ovid's Metamorphoses. In this poem, he basically, as a poet, he talks about where everything came from, how the world was created, where men came from, where everything that we see came from, and how everything changes from one form into another. Okay? So all of the myths that you can think about, the ancient myths and legends that you can think about from classical Greece and Rome, they come from Ovid's Metamorphoses. So all of those interesting stories. Okay? We'll study them. Now, the reason why these stories are so important is because if you think about medieval literature, which comes later, after ancient and classical history, when medieval writers wrote their stories, these were the stories they studied, right? Shakespeare never read Shakespeare. Shakespeare never read J.R. Tolkien. Okay, Dante wrote in 1300 AD. He never read Shakespeare. Dante read this. So writers in the medieval world read the writings of the writers from the ancient and classical world. So when we study these writings and we learn these works, when we start reading medieval literature, we understand what they're talking about because they're getting their ideas from these ideas. Okay? So we can read medieval literature and understand what they're talking about because we read the works that they read. And then when we read modern literature, we can understand modern literature because the modern writers were reading these works and the medieval writers. And so when we study ancient and classical literature, when we study medieval literature, that's what allows us to understand modern literature. Because the modern writers like Shakespeare was studying Homer and Virgil and Ovid. Shakespeare was studying Dante. Okay? And a lot of the ideas and the stories that we read about in Shakespeare, for example, those stories and ideas came from these ancient writers. And we can't understand what Shakespeare is talking about unless we know the writers that Shakespeare studied. Okay? So studying ancient literature helps us understand medieval literature. Studying medieval literature helps us understand modern literature. Studying British literature helps us understand American literature. And so, really, this English Literature 1 class is going to help us understand all the literature that comes after it. And remember, the goal of literature is to learn from the examples of other men's compositions so that we can take from them and get something to use for ourselves. Whether, we're not saying that you want to grow up to become a writer. That's not what we're saying. But anytime that you speak, anytime that you write something, let's say you want to describe something. You just want to give a description, explain something to someone. You can learn to describe things the way Homer does. You can learn to tell a story the way Virgil does when you have to tell a story. All right? You can learn, if you want to invent some imaginative story, you can learn from Ovid how to create an imaginative story because these are the masters of those things. All right? You understand that? If you want to write a political essay, you can read political essays and see how great writers wrote political essays and imitate them when you write your own political essay. So no matter what you're going to write, whether it's a letter, a business document, an advertisement, or an actual work of fiction, like a novel or something like that, the best source for ideas is to go back and study the people who have done it the best in the past. So that's what we'll be studying in English Literature 1. Okay? 4 books, 4 very important books, 4 books that I think you'll really love, and we'll go through them line by line. We'll read the whole thing together, and I'll explain all the details as we go along. All right? So that's an introduction. Let's go ahead and take a look now at the Iliad and get started there. So this is book 1 of Alexander Pope's translation of the Iliad. It was written in 750 BC about events that took place in 1200 BC. And you can see book 1, there are 24 books of this work by Homer. And like I said, it was originally written with a meter that was called dactylic hexameter. And that's a big fancy word. Dactylic hexameter. That's the meter or the rhythm that Homer wrote his poetry with. The word looks complicated, the phrase looks complicated, but it's really very simple to understand. This first part, dactylic, refers to a dactyl, which is just the Greek word for a finger. And if you think of a finger, if you look at your finger, you'll notice that your finger has one long part, one long section, and then two short sections. So a dactyl is a piece of a poem that has a long syllable followed by two short syllables. All right? Long, short, short. Every long, short, short combination is called a dactyl. All right? Now, hexameter means 6 measures. 6 measures. So we take a dactyl, long, short, short, if we think of it like that, and we repeat that 6 times. So there's 1, long, short, short. There's 2, long, short, short, 3, long, short, short, 4, long, short, short, 5, long, short, short, 6. So in Homer's poetry, every line, not every line, but normally, this is the normal meter. It's long, short, short, long, short, short, long, short, short, long, short, short, and it repeats 6 times every line. And then the next line starts over and does the same. All right? So when you think that Homer wrote 24 books in the Iliad, 24 books, and you look and you say, this book here is 500 pages. Right? Every single line in that original poem followed this rhythm. It's a Greek poem. So not only is it 24 books, not only is it 500 pages of poetry, but it's 500 pages of poetry that has a rhythm, more like a song. All right? That's the original Greek. Now, what I said was we're not going to read Homer's Greek. We're not going to read the Greek text of the Iliad. We're going to read an English translation by Alexander Pope. Alexander Pope translated the Iliad into English poetry, and he uses a different meter, a different rhythm. He uses something that's called Iambic Pentameter. A different rhythm because this rhythm is better suited to English language. This rhythm works well with Greek and Latin language. But iambic pentameter is used by the English poets. An iambic foot, or an individual part of the line, is simply short, long. Much simpler than long, short, short. Short, long. And pentameter, see, hexameter meant 6 measures. Pentameter means 5 measures. So we take the short, long, and we repeat it 5 times. Short, long, short, long, short, long, short, long. That's 4. Short, long. That's 5. that's the rhythm or meter of Alexander Pope's poem, which he translates from Homer. So if we were to read the Greek, it would feel like this. It would feel like da 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 through that meter. Okay? If we read the English poem, it has a different rhythm. It's da 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 da. Short long, short long, short long, short long, short long. And you'll see that this poem by Pope, 500 pages, is translated with this meter. Okay? So let's just look at the first line here. And you see here, you may see lines of poetry, but this is actually the rhythm of every single line of this poem. And it teaches you how to read it. So you can read it in regular prose like this. Achilles' wrath to Greece, the direful spring. Right? First line of the poem. The small text is just like an introduction. Go down to where it starts with the large A, Achilles. That first line, if I just read it with normal prose, regular English reading, I might read, Achilles' wrath to Greece, the direful spring. But that's not how it's to be read because it's a poem. Okay? Now if I use Iambic Pentameter to read it, it sounds like this. Remember, it's going to be short, long, short, long, short, long, short, long, short, long. Or we could say no accent, accent, no accent, accent. That's the idea, like a rhythm. Okay? Let's read it now poetically. It says, Achilles' wrath to Greece, the direful spring. Of woes unnumbered, heavenly goddess sing. That wrath which hurled to Pluto's gloomy reign the souls of mighty chiefs untimely slain. So you see there's a rhythm in every single line of the poem. Got that? Da 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 da. Every single line is Iambic Pentameter. So as we read this, when you read it yourself, read it slowly and get into that rhythm. And once you get used to that rhythm, you'll find it very easy to read. Now, when I read that first line, it doesn't seem to make much sense. It's not very clear, right? Achilles' wrath to Greece, the direful spring. That's not clear. But the reason why is because it's a poem. And so the poet will move things around in the sentences in order to fit the rhythm. Just like if you are writing a song. You have to move things around to make it fit the rhythm. And so if you just read it plain, it won't be very clear because it's moved around poetically to fit the rhythm. All right? But once you practice that rhythm and get used to reading with that rhythm, then it gets simpler and simpler to just focus on the story and enjoy. But that's Pope's translation. And so a couple things you need to learn here. As we get into this literature, learn these different meters. Okay? You should know what dactylic hexameter is, and that Homer's whole poem was written in a certain meter. The whole poem, 24 books. And you should know when Pope translated it, he didn't just translate it word for word like we do in Latin reading course. He actually translated it into a different kind of poetry, which is Iambic Pentameter. And you should learn how to read using this meter or rhythm and also this meter or rhythm. Okay? Because this is the meter used by our translation here. All right, so let's get started now with our reading. One of the challenges you're going to have when you read Homer's Iliad, one of the challenges is going to be a lot of historical things are referred to that you might not know about. people's names, characters, places. Okay, so I'll do my best to try to help you understand who's who as we meet the characters. And if places are important, we'll talk about what the place is, where it is, so you can understand the story. We'll go through this line by line together, and then after a while, you'll start to get more comfortable with it, and you'll be able to read it by yourself and actually understand what it's all talking about. Okay, but I'll help you to read it, to understand who the characters are, what the important places are, and I'll also explain a lot of the teachings that are in the poem as we go through, like religion that's taught, natural philosophy that's taught, moral philosophy that's taught in the poem. And we'll also look at things that Homer does, even though we're not reading his words, we can see the ways that he tells his story, how he uses different figures of speech and things like that. So we'll go through this whole poem line by line. I'll explain the details to you, and as we go through it more and more, you'll become more comfortable and will be able to read it on your own. But I'm not going to ask you to read it on your own because there's too much that you'll miss if you read it by yourself. Okay, so let's just begin with Book 1, starting with Achilles' Wrath. We'll read through it, and I'll make some comments. And for your assessment for the lesson, you're going to be asked questions that I'm going to answer for you as we go through the reading. So you can take notes as we go along. I'll tell you if there's something important to write down. You can also go back and watch these videos when it's time for you to work on your assignments. Okay, so I'll provide most of the answers for those assignments for you. So beginning at line 1, pay attention and follow the reading with me. Okay? Achilles' wrath to Greece, the direful spring of woes unnumbered, heavenly goddess, sing. That wrath which hurled to Pluto's gloomy reign the souls of mighty chiefs untimely slain, whose limbs unburied on the naked shore devouring dogs and hungry vultures tore. Since great Achilles and Atrides strove, such was the sovereign doom and such the will of Jove. We'll stop there for a minute. So the subject of this book, the subject of this poem is Achilles' wrath. That's what this whole book is about. So if someone asked you, what is Homer's Iliad about? It's about the wrath of Achilles. So jot that down. The theme, the topic of Homer's Iliad is the wrath of Achilles. Achilles was a famous, heroic Greek soldier, and he was known for his fury, for his wrath. Homer's Iliad is about Achilles' wrath. Now we know from Catholic teaching, we know that anger is one of the chief sources of sin. So do you think it's a good thing to be known for your anger or for your wrath? You think that's a good thing? No. And what we're going to find is Achilles' wrath, this anger of Achilles, gets him into trouble. Okay? Achilles' wrath, the opening words of the poem, that's the theme of the whole story, Achilles' wrath. Now you think being full of wrath would make you a good warrior in ancient warfare, hand-to-hand, sword fighting? Wrath is pretty important, right? So that anger or that battle fury, that rage in battle, you know how they let out a battle cry before they charge into battle, right? That you have to get yourself worked up into that battle rage to do what you're about to do. Well, that's good if you're trying to kill people, but it's also bad. He who lives by the sword dies by the sword. It comes back to get you. So the topic of Homer's Iliad is the wrath of Achilles. Achilles' Wrath, it says, to Greece the direful spring. What that means, a spring is a source of water, right? A spring is a source. So here's an example of Homer using a figure of speech. He refers to Achilles' wrath as the spring of something, a source of something to Greece. And direful simply means bad or harmful. So Achilles' wrath was a source of evil for the Greeks. Achilles' wrath to Greece, the direful spring. Of woes unnumbered. Achilles' wrath was the source of unnumbered woes, of countless evils. Countless evils came to Greece from Achilles' wrath. And then what Homer does, you see, he says, heavenly goddess, sing. This is a prayer. Jot this down. Homer opens the Iliad. He opens his poem with a prayer. So when I ask you questions about what does this book teach us about Greek religion, here's an example. Homer opens the Iliad with a prayer, and he prays to this heavenly goddess. Now, at that point, you don't know who this goddess is. What goddess is he praying to? He's asking the goddess to do something for him. He's saying, sing to me, heavenly goddess, about the wrath of Achilles. He's praying that this goddess would tell him about the wrath of Achilles. Why? Because he wasn't there. Homer's writing in 750 BC. The Trojan War took place in 1200 BC. That was almost 500 years ago. Homer wasn't there. What he's doing is he's praying that the goddess who was there, who knows about it, would sing to him, would reveal to him the history. You understand that? He's asking the goddess to reveal to him what happened. Reveal to me, he's praying, the story of the wrath of Achilles. And if we ask, who is this goddess that he's praying to, it's in the next section. Look down lower. It says, declare, O Muse. You see that? The Muse is the spirit or goddess that he's praying to. And what the Muses were in Greek religion, the Muses were believed to be spirits that inspired artists, musicians, poets, and so on. So Homer, as a poet, is praying to the goddess of poetry. Follow me here. Homer, as a poet, is praying to the goddess of poetry that she would reveal to him the story of the wrath of Achilles. So to a Greek person reading this, this is divinely inspired. How we say the Bible is inspired by the Holy Spirit, and the prophets had things revealed to them that they spoke and wrote down in the scriptures. The Greeks believed that this poem by Homer was a religious book. Do you understand that? They believed that this was like sacred scripture. This was divinely revealed, this story. So this poem by Homer was like their Bible. It was revealed by the gods to Homer, who wrote it down and sang it. But it was heavenly. It was divine. So make sure you jot that down. To the Greeks, this book was understood to be sacred writing. This wasn't just Homer's story. This was a story that was inspired by the gods. Homer presents himself as an inspired writer, an inspired poet. Now the question for us is, was he really an inspired poet? Was there really some spirit that actually revealed things to Homer? So is this poem, this is a question for us to seek an answer to. Is this poem just something that Homer's writing? He's making it up? Or is this poem actually a poem that was revealed to Homer by some spirit? Because at the beginning of the poem, that's what he's asking for. He's asking this spirit, this muse, to reveal to him this story, this poem. You see that? So we have a question to answer. Is Homer actually an inspired writer, or is he just making this up? Why do you think it would be a good idea for a poet to make up this story that he received the message from a goddess? It'd make his story a lot more interesting, wouldn't it? To say, oh, a spirit revealed this to me. That would make it interesting, right? It also might make people afraid to question it. If I say, oh, don't question my story, it was told to me by a goddess. So is it possible that he was just making that up to make his story seem more important? Maybe. Or maybe he actually was inspired by some spirit. Now think about it. Could we make an argument that he was actually inspired by some goddess? I could make an argument because his book is so famous. Is it possible that he just happened to write a book that, this was written in 750 BC, we're 2020 AD, 2,800 years later, we're still studying his book? Is that just coincidental? He just happened to write a good story that's been read all through human history? Or is it possible that his story was supernatural, and that's why it's so famous? Okay? So there is an argument that can be made why we should think that maybe his story was influenced by some spirit. Maybe that's why it's so famous. Maybe that's why it's so good. Because it's actually more than just human poetry. Maybe it's spiritually inspired poetry. And that's what he presents to us at the beginning of this poem. It starts with a prayer. So he says, "Sing to me of Achilles' wrath, which brought unnumbered woes upon the Greeks. That wrath, sing to me about that wrath which hurled to Pluto's gloomy reign the souls of mighty chiefs." What that means is, sing to me about Achilles' wrath, which hurled to Pluto's gloomy reign. That means which cast down into hell. Pluto in classical mythology was the god of the underworld. He was the god of the dead. And his reign, his gloomy reign, was his dark kingdom under the earth, where all the dead went. So what it means there, again, this is another example of figures of speech and poetry. Homer could have just said, tell me about Achilles' wrath, which killed lots of people. But he doesn't present it like that. He presents it in figurative language. He says, tell me about that wrath which hurled to Pluto's gloomy reign the souls of mighty chiefs untimely slain. That means killed while they were still young. So the wrath of Achilles killed mighty chiefs and cast their souls down into hell while they were still young, still strong. What does this teach us about Greek religion? Remember, I want you to jot down what we find taught to us by Homer about Greek religion. Did Greeks believe in the existence of a soul? Did the Greeks believe that we have a soul? Yes or no?
Yeah.
Yeah, right? He says, tell me about the souls of mighty chiefs. So they believed in the existence of a soul. And what happens to the soul after we die? What did the Greeks believe? The soul goes down somewhere into what we would call hell. Not necessarily hell meaning like eternal punishment, but some place where departed souls go after death. So the body would be buried or burned, and they believed that the soul went down into the underworld. And if you wonder what is the underworld, we're going to learn, because in the Odyssey, Odysseus goes to the underworld. And we go on a journey with Odysseus into the underworld, and we see what's down there. Okay? So the Greeks believed in gods and goddesses. The Greeks believed that man has a soul and a body. And they believed that when a man dies, his soul leaves his body and goes somewhere. You got that? Now, I guarantee if you read that story, if you read that opening paragraph, you wouldn't realize that there's that much stuff being taught in these lines already. Okay? Because you take a lot of this for granted, because you're used to talking about souls and gods and spirits and things like that. But I want you to pay attention and realize what we're learning about Homer's religion. Remember, we're focusing on the writer. We're focusing on the writer. What does Homer believe? Homer believes in gods and goddesses. He believes in the existence of a soul. He believes in the existence of hell. And he lives 700 years before Christ in a pagan country. He's not a Jew. So this shows us that the pagans, far away from Israel, far away from the Old Testament scriptures, believed in gods and goddesses and the soul and hell. These weren't ideas that Christians invented. Even non-Jews believed in these ideas. Okay? Timing? About an hour? Okay. All right, so in that opening paragraph there, we already are starting to see Homer's religion taught to us, right? We see that he presents this as a poem that was revealed to him by a spirit. He talks about souls, gods, goddesses, hell, heaven. He says heavenly goddess, right? Okay? Heaven, hell, souls, gods, goddesses. There's lots of religion here already. Talk to me, spirit, about the wrath which cast all of these mighty kings down into hell, whose limbs unburied on the naked shore. Their bodies were unburied. You think that's good or bad? That's bad. That's another part of their religion. They believed that if your body was not given a burial, your soul was trapped. Now in the next line, we read, since great Achilles and Atrides strove. We have these two names, Achilles and Atrides. All right? These are the two main characters of this story. And we read here that they strove against each other. They had a fight. Both of these men are Greeks. Both of them are Greeks. So there are two Greeks who got into a disagreement. And that disagreement, which was caused by Achilles' anger, caused all of these evils to come upon the Greeks. Okay? But these are the two main characters. Atrides is not actually the person's name. There are two main characters. One is Achilles. He's the famous warrior, this famous Greek soldier. But the second character is a king whose name is Agamemnon. Agamemnon is the second important character. He's referred to by Homer as Atrides. That's just a way of referring to him. What Atrides means is son of Atreus. That's what Atrides means, because Agamemnon's father was Atreus. Atrides means son of Atreus. So the two characters are Achilles and Agamemnon. So when you see Atrides, it's the same thing as son of Atreus. Sometimes you'll see him referred to as son of Atreus. Sometimes you'll see him referred to as Atrides. Sometimes you'll see him named Agamemnon. That's his actual name. So these terrible things happened. Mighty chiefs, their souls were cast down into hell. Their bodies were left unburied on the shore. All of these evils came upon the Greeks because Achilles and Atrides got into a fight, which was caused by the wrath of Achilles. Okay? And he says, such was the sovereign doom, such was the will of Jove. Jove is the chief god. Jove is Jupiter. It's the same thing. So you've heard of the god Jupiter. And Jupiter is the same person as Zeus. The Greeks referred to him as Zeus. The Romans referred to him as Jupiter. Jove, this word Jove, is another form of the noun Jupiter in Latin. It's an irregular noun. Jupiter is the nominative, and then Jovis is the genitive. That's where Jove comes from. Okay? So Jove and Jupiter are the same person. It's the greatest of the gods. So this fight that took place between Achilles and Agamemnon was something that Homer says Zeus allowed or caused to happen, and it created all of this evil for the Greeks. So the fight between Achilles and Agamemnon was sort of a punishment on the Greeks that Jupiter used to punish the Greeks, and he did it through the fight between Achilles and Agamemnon, which was caused by Achilles' anger. Okay? And that's the end of that first paragraph, and I think that gives us a good introduction to the poem. So we're going to stop this first lesson there and pick up with the story in our next lesson. But what I'd like you to know at this point, first of all, we did a lot of introductory stuff. We talked about English, high school English, what you need to study in high school English. We talked about how there are 3 parts of high school English: grammar, composition, and literature. We talked about why we study them, why we study literature, what the difference is between studying literature and just reading books, right? Then we talked about the 4 different English literature courses that we have and what we study in them. We talked about English Literature 1. We said we're going to study ancient and classical literature, but it's going to be an English translation. We talked about the poetic style of Homer and the poetic style of Alexander Pope, who translated it into English, and how you need to remember this when you read it and learn to read it as a poem. Okay? It's much easier to read if you read it as a poem. And then we went through the first paragraph and we talked about the topic or the subject of the Iliad, what this poem is about. We talked about religion. We talked about the fact that this poem is presented to us as a divinely inspired story about the past. We talked about what it reveals about Homer's religious beliefs. Okay? And I told you, one of the questions in your assessments is going to be, what does this book tell us about Greek religion? All right? So you need to make sure you're paying attention to that. Natural philosophy, we learn about the earth, for example, that the souls of the dead go into the underworld. So if you think about how does a Greek think about the natural world, he thinks that the earth is a place where underneath the earth, there's some place where all the dead souls go. That's natural philosophy. All right? Moral philosophy. What does this teach us about moral philosophy? We've only read a few lines, and we've already learned about the importance of burial. We've learned about the danger of anger. So you see how there's a lot of teaching in this poem. Philosophy, religion, and literature. We've seen Homer use a number of figurative expressions already. What does he mean by the direful spring? What did we say a spring means?
Water.
Well, it's a source of something. Well, a spring is just a source of water, but Homer uses it figuratively to just refer to a source of anything. You know what I mean? Like if I said, Dan, you're a real source of trouble, Homer would say, you're a spring of evil. You see how that's a figurative expression, okay? A poetic way of expressing an idea. So what do we want to take away from this writing for our own composition? How to say things in figurative ways, right? Isn't that more illustrative? Doesn't that really make it clear that you're a spring of evil? You're like a fountain of evil. That's much clearer than just saying you're a source of evil. So we see there's an example of figurative speech. We see referring to death. When he talks about death, he talks about being hurled down into Pluto's reign, right? Into Pluto's kingdom. That's how he refers to death, you know? So if I was going to kill you in war, instead of saying, I'm going to kill you, I could say, I'm going to cast your soul into Pluto's gloomy reign, right? That's figurative speech, poetic speech, all right? There's a simple, plain way that you can say something, or you can express it in a more rhetorical way, a more illustrative way. So what I want you to see is there's so much stuff in this poem, and we have to unpack it all as we read it. But that's all for Lesson 1.